Howdy, Humanities 2, Shasta College. We're trips on our way through the art, the things that matter in our culture for the last 500 years. And now we're into the glorious 60s. Um, Lots is happening in this 1960s. Now, the decade started off kind of slow, but we have a new president. What goes on in the culture, remember, always reflects what goes on in the art. That's the whole point of what I'm trying to get through in this whole course. If you can connect those dots, what's happening in the culture influences the art, the music, the painting, everything. That's the key to this course and the critical analysis of those art movements. I'm going to do something a little different from now to the end, I think. I'm going to go decade by decade until we're done, instead of going genre by genre, meaning music, and then do painting, and then do. It's too slow. So I'm going to jam everything into the decades. What mattered in those decades. And that way you'll see that in some decades, music didn't matter that much, films didn't matter that much, paintings didn't matter that much, or did they? It's up to you to decide. Stuff is out there. People are always creating. 60s. We're starting off with a brand new president. He is a Catholic, Irish Catholic, John F. Kennedy. Young, the youngest president we've ever elected. And that record held until Barack Obama was elected. Young, vivacious, handsome, wealthy, from the Kennedy family, married to a trophy wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. And he was coming out with a lot of promise of a new world. We're coming out of the 1950s, the kind of conservative era, the black and white era, Eisenhower button-down era of repression, communist witch hunts, Cold War, and people are frankly wanting a new deal. And they thought a Democrat could bring it. Did he? Perhaps. He died for it. He died for his sins. And that changed the entire landscape of our culture. And I don't believe we've ever recovered. That's how his assassination affected everything. Everything. Okay, here we are. What's happening in the 60s? Well, there's this generation that they call, unfortunately, called the baby boomers. That starts right after World War II, 1946, thereabout, and goes until 1964, folks. The year the Beatles performed on Ed Sullivan. That's a lot of years. A lot of kids are being born because, well, people have to be married to have kids, to have sex. They're still getting married. Nobody's living in sin, except for the radical artist types would do such a thing, an affront to the culture. And there wasn't a lot of birth control going on, old school birth control. This isn't a sex education class, but you have to figure out what old school birth control is on your own. Let's just put it this way, there was no birth control pills or fancy schmancy stuff. It was all pretty primitive. And people were, it's hard to put a damper on humans' libidos, especially after they come out of survive the wars, and they wanted to have some fun. And now the product of that fun are starting to become 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, toddlers, older than that. and they're starting to look at where they fit in the world. Where does a 14-year-old in 1960 fit in when all he sees is his parents' world? So, or she, or they, where do they fit in? It's hard to find a spot. So artists jump in there to fill that spot, to answer that call, answer that question. Filmmakers, Hollywood, music, painters. But we'll start with a British pop group called the Beatles. Maybe you're sick of hearing about them. Their cultural significance cannot be over explained or over analyzed because it was that profound, is that profound. People are still analyzing it. Paul McCartney is still on tour. He's pushing 80. Ringo is 80 plus. John Lennon, if he had not been shot down like a dog in New York City, would be 80. George Harrison would be pushing in on 80 if he hadn't died of cancer. His beloved cigarettes killed him finally. Their music that they made changed the entire compass, the entire access of the world. The entire world, not just British or American, the entire world reverberated with the change that they brought about. Kennedy had been brutally assassinated. He wasn't finished with his first term yet. He was starting to get bogged down in a little place in Southeast Asia called Vietnam. They thought that perhaps China was coming into Vietnam to push their communist ideals, and Vietnam was a weak country that needed lots of Chinese help. And so that was a window of opportunity that China essentially wanted to take full advantage of. Well, Americans, because we're the police force for the entire world, evidently, um, saw this happening in this little country. Really, nobody paid attention to much. Um, and they thought that was going to spread communism. That was just going to be the tip of the iceberg. It would spread through Southeast Asia to South America to Africa. And we essentially wanted to put a halt to it. Now, Vietnam had been bogged down already in a war before we got there, and France was in there, believe it or not. And they didn't do very well. Now it's our turn. And Kennedy was giving the green light to it. During his stay in the White House, Russia, Soviet Union, tried to put nuclear warheads, nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, which was one of their satellite islands of fellow communists, 90 miles off the shore of the United States of America. Kennedy was not going to have that. The government wasn't going to have it. And this was in the days when the government worked together, Republicans and Democrats, not like now. There is no working together, but that's another story. Everybody saw the danger of Russia, Soviet Union setting up a nuclear armaments that close to the free nation of the United States. And so Kennedy sent out ships to stop it, to waylay it, and it for a couple of days before he was brutally assassinated, we were on the verge of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union if it failed. The good news, it didn't. Soviet Union backed down. The nukes were never put on the island of Cuba, and Kennedy was a hero. A year later, he was dead. And what they say, the good die young. Okay, now that's the background, what's going on. Here comes these lads, 4 lads from Liverpool, England, a port city in England, blue-collar town, not a sophisticated place, not London, not swinging London, baby. And they put together a rock and roll band based on their desire to play the music they loved, which was influenced by American rock and roll, from Little Richard to Chuck Berry to the Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly. They played their own instruments. They sang together, they played together. They're starting to write songs together. John Lennon, Paul McCartney. And we heard about them in this country, but we never saw them play. This is before television had them on everything. It's before YouTube videos and Instagram and the whole bit. There was no social network. It was all word of mouth, old school. But we'd heard about it and curious about it. Not only were they creating this rock and roll music, making it their own, they were creating a new look for men, a fashion look, by growing their hair out. And that was a radical thing to do. And they were playing in the Cavern in Liverpool, and then they played in Hamburg, Germany, because that was a paying gig. And they polished their chops there, night, honing their performances, starting to get the right songs, honing that, and trying to establish some sort of identity that could get them out into the world. And indeed it did. Here comes a man, Brian Epstein, parents were rather wealthy. They owned a shop that sold, amongst other things, records. And he saw an opportunity to perhaps put some of his financing backing behind this Liverpool pop group that he admired so much. It was also a closeted homosexual, tortured soul that he was, and he was gravely in love with John Lennon, and he wanted to do for these lads, these 4 talented kids. He was a couple years older than they were. He wanted to give them a shot. And so he became their manager. He changed them in a lot of ways. He made them clean up their act, made them all dress alike in similar suits. They all got the same haircut. They became favorites of not just the youth, but older generation liked them too, because they looked like polite, good boys. They weren't ruffians with black leather jackets. They used to be, but they aren't now, because they were copying their heroes from the United States, the biker movies like The Wild One, Elvis. They were going after the naughty boy image, but that was left for the Rolling Stones, which were on their way to becoming, alongside the Beatles, as another band that changed the entire way of the cultures. So the Beatles I can't explain them in 5 minutes of lecturing, but they still thrive. They still are in the culture. People are still analyzing who, what, why, where, and they swept the entire world off their feet. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, The communist bloc countries, not so much because they didn't like rock and roll and they tried to keep it out. So they had to only hear it through Radio Free Europe, which is banned, but the radio was strong enough to get through to the communist bloc countries. And so they were listening to it. So the youth rebellion is on. Finally, the youth, these baby boomers, were hearing something that represented how they were feeling. Coming up right behind them, similar times to different circumstances, was a band called the Rolling Stones, whose main influences were American blues players like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Robert Johnson, and they put their own take on it, a rock beat onto it. They had a different presentation. The Rolling Stones, if you know, they're on tour right now. They're still going. Two of them are left. I don't count Ron Wood. Yes, he's been there for a long time, but he wasn't there during the crucial elements of the Stones, which would be the early 60s, middle 70s, up until the middle 70s, which they created the greatest music of their entire career, minus Ron Wood, who has the luckiest job ever. Beloved Charlie Watts just passed away this couple months ago, 80 years old, the drummer, rock steady drummer, who was the backbeat to everything the Rolling Stones represented. That's how powerful music was at one time. That's how meaningful it was. And this spawned an entire British invasion, they called it. Bands from Manchester, Liverpool, and London, the Animals, the Kinks, the Yardbirds, them, the Hollies, the Who. The first British invasion slammed into America like a rocket, and we embraced them. We had a television show here that was from a radio show, which was from a columnist named by the name of Ed Sullivan, who was an arbiter of presenting entertainment to the culture every Sunday night at 8 o'clock, folks. We lived by Ed Sullivan. The entire nation gathered around their TV sets, most of them black and white, to watch the Ed Sullivan Show every Sunday. Ed was kind of a awkward host. He looked like he was sort of not hip. He wasn't groovy. And he introduced the country to Elvis Presley. Later on, he introduced the Beatles to everybody. The seismic shift in the fault lines of America shifted that night that Ed Sullivan had the Beatles. January 1964. A couple months later, they had the Rolling Stones. A couple months later, they had the Animals, the Hollies, essentially all the British invasion bands that we all could not get enough of when we were kids. Dave Clark 5, Herman's Hermits, Freddie and the Dreamers, Jerry and the Pacemakers. Have you ever heard of any of these bands? Check them out on YouTube. They're all out there. You might think the music's kind of simple and corny. Nothing simple about it. It was the music of our lives. If that makes it simple, so be it. And they did it with electric guitars and drums. Think about that, folks. The revolution wasn't with rifles and swords and knives. It was with electric guitars and drums. In the meantime, the rock and roll was sweeping the world American bands are starting to happen too, based on the British invasion bands. Absolutely. We had the Byrds, Lovin' Spoonful, Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, the Beach Boys. At one time was our version of Clean Cut America, Surfing USA. Everybody's going surfing, Surfing USA. Problem is most of the country had never been on a surfboard, and neither had Brian Wilson who wrote the song. But he presented a dream, an ideal in the country, something to strive for, and it looked pretty nice. And it looked hopeful. In the midst of all this hope, the civil rights movement was happening. Martin Luther King was giving speeches. Malcolm X was giving speeches. They worked two different crowds. Martin Luther King was the peaceful one who based so much of his teachings not just on Jesus, but also Gandhi, who had brought India down to its knees at one time before he was assassinated. Malcolm X didn't do that. He was preaching fight. For the first time in this country, African Americans had leaders. Join one group or the other, join both. Martin Luther King was all about resistance and turning the other cheek, and Malcolm X was all about resistance and fighting back. In a few short years, they're both assassinated. That put the kibosh on that. This is happening. Why this great music is happening. The turmoil of the great music of the 60s is all mixed with assassinations, starting with John F. Kennedy, our president. Vietnam War now is going full on. We've got 100,000 guys over there. They've reestablished the draft in America. Yes, 18-year-olds, think about it. You could be drafted into the army and you would go to Vietnam. What do you think about the draft right now? Would you like to be a part of a draft right now? Well, that's happening. There's unrest on the college campuses because of that. You could go to college and get a deferment. That means you're not going to go to the army as long as you're in college. And so everybody's hiding in college except for the poor people and minorities who couldn't hide in college because they didn't have the ways and means or the grades. And so they were getting drafted like crazy and they were dying for their country. A country they weren't feeling too much a part of. In a land they didn't understand, in a conflict in Vietnam that they didn't understand. It wasn't the good war like World War II. The enemy wasn't Hitler or Japan, clear-cut enemies. It was an idea. Communism is an idea. It's hard to go to war with an idea, folks. But we did. Midst of all this, television was ruling the world in the United States. Movies had gone downhill because they couldn't keep up with television. It was too popular and it was free. Yes, there was commercials, but we put up with it. We didn't know any different. And we sat at home and we watched some great shows like Bonanza, and some lousy shows like I Dream of Jeannie. Still fun. Gilligan's Island, yeah. In the height of Beatlemania, Gilligan's Island's are one of our top shows. Bewitched. These are kind of fantasy, whimsical shows that America just couldn't get enough of. And then there'd be other shows like I Spy that came out. which was a satire on the James Bond theme, and starred an African American actor who's in disgrace now, Bill Cosby. We never seen anything like that before. He was the co-star with Robert Culp. They were spies going out throughout the world, fighting communism, essentially. They were hip too. They were swingers. They dressed cool. They quoted poetry, and they looked great, flittering about the world like James Bond does still. These things were in the pop culture at the time. In the pop culture, painting, Warhol was huge, the king, but there were other pop culture painters who were equally as important, perhaps better. Roy Lichtenstein was one. His paintings were blowing people's minds, and yes, it possibly helped to be on drugs to appreciate them. Claus Oldenburg, Richard Max was a psychedelic painter who was changing the way we looked at fashion, movie posters, album covers. Album covers became great art. The album itself became a great piece of art up until the 60s. The single was the popular art form when the Beatles started recording serious albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver, and of course, the granddaddy of all, Sgt. Pepper's albums became the art of choice for musicians. And so, everywhere from the Beach Boys producing Pet Sounds to the Zombies producing their great albums to the Faces, then Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, and the Kinks producing some of the greatest albums that they ever produced. We're telling stories in the long form of LP, long player, album. You would call it vinyl now. We call them albums. 5 songs on each side. There you go. And we played this stuff over and over and over again. Then a black musician from America goes to England to get noticed. His name is Jimi Hendrix, born and raised in Seattle, played left guitar, handed guitar, and changed the entire culture yet again. Died young, 27, of drug overdose. But before that, he played a monstrous, popular rock festival called Monterey Pop, and he followed that with Woodstock. Um, it's hard to explain the cultural phenomenon of all these events. In literature, the writers that were getting noticed were read by the youth market. Ken Kesey, who wrote Sometimes a Great Notion and One for the Cuckoo's Nest, and was a proponent of LSD, was dropping LSD, writing his novels, and people were reading them, and they're following him. And he got in a psychedelic bus that they painted a bunch of alternative people. They weren't really hippies, but people want to call them that. That's fine. And they drove across America high on LSD, preaching the gospel of the new way of doing things. Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco exploded. And to this day, when you say the word Haight-Ashbury, you know what I'm talking about. Pardon me. I'll be talking about this stuff more because I can't just talk about the 60s, the decade, in a 30-minute lecture. It's impossible. But the things I want you guys to look at, literature besides Ken Kesey, a great author, came out of World War II. Kurt Vonnegut was writing novels that represented a, a generation that wasn't his generation. He was my dad's generation, but he was writing to the baby boomers generation with his books called Slaughterhouse Five, Cat's Cradle, and the rest. And kids, college kids, it was hip to read, folks, in those days because they saw a movie called The Graduate, which was another film. I'll talk about that later. That changed everything. It made wanting to go to college look like something really cool and doable. Reading, being an intellectual, understanding authors, not just Shakespeare, but people like Kurt Vonnegut and Richard Brodigan. Things were happening on in New York with Off Broadway, playwrights like Sam Shepard and David Mamet were starting to get a voice with small audiences, and they're having a platform for their voice. And that is another place that youth could go to see something that they could relate to. 1969 was a turnabout year. The 60s were in full bloom, much to the disappointment of the past generation who didn't understand the music, the clothes, the styles, the supposed free love that was going on, scared them. But that generation, which would be my generation, folks, up until that time was probably the freest generation in the history of the world. We didn't have to work on a farm. We could get a car. We could get a girl. We could smoke some pot. We could listen to some music. We could have our own thoughts, our own writers, our own directors, our own painters that were our generation. And that was powerful, powerful thing. And then two things put the kibosh on the 60s. Charles Manson, would be petty thief, had been in and out of jail most of his life, had a cult of followers, that he was a wannabe songwriter who wanted to be famous like everybody else. He got his songs to some people like Dennis Wilson from the Beach Boys, Terry Melcher, who was a producer, who produced the Byrds, and Paul Revere and the Raiders, was Doris Day's son. If you know who Doris Day is, she was a popular actress in the 50s and 60s. He was a golden boy of the hippie era. He got his songs to these people, important people. But he also brought along a dark cloud. And when his songs were rejected, he sent his minions to their houses to murder them. And that's what happened with Sharon Tate's murder. Maybe you've seen Tarantino's new movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We'll talk about that later. That's rewriting history, by the way, like Tarantino always does. And then in December of that same year, after Manson, which was in about August of that year, there was a free concert that the Rolling Stones gave at the Ultimate Speedway. It was called, they referred to, it was called Ultimate. There's a great movie about it called Gimme Shelter. You should watch it. I might make you watch it when we you'll see scenes from it when we start seeing some documentaries. The Maisel brothers made that documentary about the Rolling Stones tour of 1969, and it ends in that fated moment on that fated speedway, which is down by Modesto, if you know where that is, middle of San Joaquin Valley in California. And it was nothing but bad drugs and murder most foul. Shutting the door on the hippie dream and opening a door to a decade, the 70s, which once again changed everything to come. More on that later. I'll sign to your paper tomorrow. Be looking for it. Your next essay. Enjoy your weekend.